This is week 5, lecture 2. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation tonight, the Second Great Awakening, according to historian Mark Noll, is the most influential revival of Christianity in the history of the United States. And its most well-known practitioner, thinker, and writer, and pastor and evangelist, Charles Finney, he says a good case can be made that Finney should be ranked with Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and Andrew Carnegie, or he said, actually in the book he said, and any other kind of significant influential industrialist, as the most important public figures of all of 19th century America. Notice that this is a profoundly important Christian event, but a profoundly important American event at the same time. So tonight, we're going to focus our conversation now tonight on the coming of the Second Great Awakening and why it was so important in American life. In the Second Great Awakening, when we think about what kicked it off, it could be the 1780s and 90s, but symbolically we'll look for the turn of the century in 1801 in the frontier of Kentucky. A revival took place at Cane Ridge. At this revival, there was a pastor named James McGready, Scottish, common sense realist, revival frontier pastor, who lived in Kentucky. And in August of 1801, they held a protracted camp meeting. We talked about camp meetings last week as this new sort of cultural form that took place not in settled societies where you went to church every day, but in frontier locations where people lived further apart and there was less settled institutions. And it was also part of these communion events, the season of communion that Scottish that sort of Scots-Irish brought with them in the Presbyterians as they came into the colonies and into America in the late 18th century, a practice from Scotch-Irish Presbyterianism that they brought from there to the frontier in America of a communion season, gathering for several days at a time for churches that were scattered across a given region. So during this particular camp meeting in a communion season, there were thousands of people who streamed in. There were both black and white people and preachers. There were Presbyterians and Baptists, and now huge numbers of Methodists. The structure was completely changing in terms of who counted as a religious authority on the American frontier. They were fervently preaching the good news. They set up stands like the one you see in the picture. Other than that, they just stood on a rock, or wherever they could get a lift in the land and preached to whoever would listen. The backcountry setting unleashed behaviors that any Puritan would have found aghast, right, outside of the Salem witch trials. Under the power and the influence of the Holy Spirit, people showed unusual bodily effects like jerking and dancing, uncontrollable laughter, running back and forth, and even barking in the spirit, right? This kind of power of religious ecstasy was unleashed with a sort of frontier freedom that had not really been seen in the American revival context before. People, of course, as you might imagine, in the East freaked out at what in the world was going on out in the West. But in the frontier, many began to argue for greater influence of revivals themselves. As I mentioned before, Timothy Dwight, who was then president at Yale, was praying and preaching for the revival of the conversion of the indifferent among the student body at Yale, about 250 people by that point, all men, of course. He was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, and he saw the effects of the skepticism of the French Enlightenment on his students. And he challenged their infidelity and started a process of preaching on the basics, the fundamentals of faith, to reacquaint his students with what it truly meant to be a Christian and to restore their confidence in the Bible. In that process of preaching on the essentials of the faith, over the course of about a year or two, about 1/3 of the student body at Yale was converted newly to revived faith in Jesus, right? So this revival spirit was both in the West and in the settled East as these new measures began to take effect. I thought I would talk for just a minute about Lyman Beecher. There is no more important late 18th and early 19th century religious figure in American life than Lyman Beecher, pastor and cultural and religious authority. He was father to Henry Ward Beecher, who was perhaps the most important preacher and religious figure in American life in the 19th century period. He was also father to Catherine Beecher, who was a 19th century reformer that brought education and higher education to women. And he was also father to Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, about whom Abraham Lincoln, when he met her, said, "And here's the lady that started the Civil War." So a family, a New England family that had greater influence on American life, one can probably not find until you get to the 20th century and the Kennedys. It was the Beecher family with that strong influence that led to a whole new way of thinking about religious organization and structure in American life. And that structure is the voluntary society. Lyman Beecher himself, as a settled minister, started forming societies in 1810 in order to lead to greater religious and social reform, especially as we were moving from east to west across the country and evangelizing both newcomers and those who were moving out to the American West. Notice, and just for the purposes of illustration, I'm just going to run through them. 1810, the American Board of Foreign Missions. 1816, the American Bible Society still exists. 1817, the Colonization Society for Liberated Slaves. 1824, the American Sunday School Union, perhaps the 19th century's most influential ecclesial organization, some might argue. 1825, the American Tract Society. If people aren't going to hear the message in the church, they've got to have some sort of compelling tract that will introduce them to the truths of the faith. 1826, the American Education Society. 1826, later that year, the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, right? This was in league with economic growth and development. A shopkeeper's millennium is what Paul Johnson called it. In order to conquer the West, you can't do it if you're drunk, right? And then 1826, also later on in that year, the American Home Missionary Society. So in addition to sending missionaries abroad, we need to send them in our own country, right, as we move west across. Notice, right, that this massive energy in the period of about 15 years, about 8 or 10 incredibly influential societies that dominated the American reform life. The idea here, notice, is that this energy is not coming from established churches. It's not coming from settled congregations. It's not coming from established congregational or Episcopal or Anglican churches in Virginia. It is coming from voluntary societies. And as denominations were growing, so were voluntary societies that were trans-denominational, right? Not only influential in their own individual denominations that were becoming very important and growing, the Baptist, the Methodist, others, but societies that actually started in one but included many different denominational groups as they approached their influence in the United States. As we get into the revivalism of the 19th century and the influence of the Second Great Awakening, let's talk for just a minute, if we can, about its two most important figures. And that first one, actually, you know what? I apologize. My brain is getting ahead of me. I thought for our purposes that we would actually, for just a moment, compare the First and the Second Great Awakenings, right? And I think this is maybe just for illustrative purposes helpful to take a moment and just compare them in a very general sense. Again, this is very general, and if you get too far into generalizations, you might find that they might not be all that helpful, right? But the first two things is they shared actually things in common. In the First and Second Great Awakening, they were both concerned for personal salvation, and they were both concerned about worldwide revival, not just in America, but around the world. But then their similarities begin to break down and the differences become more apparent. Whereas the First Great Awakening took place primarily in the East, in the 13 colonies settled upon the Atlantic Ocean before the Revolution, the Second Great Awakening not only took place in the East, but also in the West, in uncharted, unengaged territory as we moved our influence west across the Appalachians and into a new part of the North American landscape. Whereas the First Great Awakening was strongest among Congregationalists, Anglicans, and Presbyterians, the Methodist groups that we talk about here are the denominations we talk about are Methodist and Baptist, and the Christian churches, the Disciples of Christ, and the Churches of Christ, right? Whole new organizations that are growing and thriving across the country. Whereas in the First Great Awakening, their focus, the legacy was temporary. It led to a spike in church membership, but then another decline right after that. The Second Great Awakening had a much longer and permanent legacy in American life of the changing role of religion in American public life, as we talked about in the previous lecture. And then finally, whereas the First Great Awakening was empowered and driven by a Calvinistic teaching and the inability of humans to save themselves, the Second Great Awakening really focused on a more Arminian future where all people can come to Christ if they will but decide on their own. The two most influential figures that we can use to tell the story of the rise of the Second Great Awakening and its impact on American life are Francis Asbury and Charles Finney. Let's start with Francis Asbury. Francis Asbury, who lived from 1745 to 1816, was a Methodist who was born in England, and actually early in his life in Birmingham, England, was an early follower of John Wesley. Before we talk a little bit more about Asbury in North America, I thought I would talk for just a little bit about the innovations of the Methodist teaching that came out of England into North America, and clarify a couple of things for you that theologically you've probably heard of, and maybe you studied Wesley in your church history class when you got to the 18th century, but we'll talk about this more specifically in the American context. There are two basic Methodist teachings that you need to be familiar with. The first is the second blessing, and the second is entire sanctification. The second blessing focuses on a distinct post-conversion experience of grace that brings the believer into a deeper, more complete relationship with God. John Wesley himself, in his Aldersgate experience, spoke of his heart being strangely warmed when he walked into a church, into a prayer meeting. In this particular context, it is associated then with the work of the Holy Spirit, purifying the heart from sin and filling the believer with a sense of divine love and also Christian and moral purpose. Wesley believed that while justification, being made right with God, happens at the time of conversion, there is a further work of grace, a second blessing, a subsequent action where that grace is fully extended to the life of the believer, and the believer fully gives him or herself over to the ministry of the Holy Spirit. The second concept that goes hand in hand with that is this idea of entire sanctification. This is the goal of the second blessing and refers to the state of being wholly and completely devoted to God, freed from the power of sin and perfected in divine love. Wesley described this as a moment in which a believer's heart is fully purified from sinful desires and filled with the perfect love of God, and for others. However, he didn't see this as an absolute perfection, but as a continued, renewed process to develop a heart of grace. The idea that one eventually in the Methodist environment, that one could live a sinless life before God when giving yourself fully over and being entirely sanctified in your individual life. So his teaching on entire sanctification then became a defining feature of Methodism and later influenced all the holiness movements and also Pentecostalism. The Pentecostal innovation in the early 20th century would be that the sign of that second blessing was speaking in tongues, right? So this idea of an initial conversion, but a second something else, right, really comes out of the movement of Methodism in the late 18th century. As part of this process, we develop what some have called the Methodist paradox, that the Methodists, as they spread across the United States and into the West, number one, they believed that one needed to be completely free outside of the bonds of a powerful local church, to leave old structures behind that offered up freedom of engagement and opportunity, to go from the model of the settled church to where the gospel was most needed, to jump on horseback and go, right? It is said that Francis Asbury traveled more than 300,000 miles, most of it on horseback while he was in North America, and he crossed the Appalachian Mountains more than 60 times. By the way, these are in harrowing conditions. There's no trails here, folks. And the idea that in every effort made to save lost souls. But at the same time, in that context of freedom, there was a strong, highly structured ideal in the Methodist Church, one of structure and discipline, of local classes preaching circuits and general conferences that kept people in a common authority and relationship as they spread the gospel across the country. It leads me, by the way, to a good joke. And again, why in the world I'm talking about Stanley Hauerwas all the time? I was talking to my wife about this the other day. I keep quoting Hauerwas in all these classes. Probably says something more about me than I think should be said. But it was Stanley Hauerwas who one time in a conference joked that long after Christianity is dead and buried and gone, the United Methodist Church will be thriving, right? And what he meant by that was sort of a hint at the structure, the organization of it that was so very clearly and disciplined, in a disciplined way, developed in the 19th century. The influence, by the way, of him and the Methodists cannot be overstated, right? Statistics don't tell the whole story, but get this one. In 1771, there were 4 Methodist ministers in America on the eve of the American Revolution, caring for about 300 Methodist lay people. By 1816, right, just about less than 50 years later, there were 2,000 Methodist ministers in the United States, now after the Revolution, caring for more than 200,000 or more lay people, right? As a movement, it exploded in the United States. So this influence of Asbury and this new way of thinking of a second blessing and entire sanctification with a democratic, friendly theological message that empowered the individual to make a moral and a religious decision for themselves cannot overstate the influence of Francis Asbury and Methodism across the middle colonies and into the southern colonies and as we move west. But perhaps the most important figure in modern American revivalism that we'll learn about tonight is Charles Finney, a rather austere-looking gentleman. I picked a picture that actually makes him look a little bit more friendly than the one that you often see. He looks like a very angry, disciplined person. He advocated what we call new pragmatic revivalistic methods. When asked about whether or not his influence, his new ideas worked, or whether or not they were justified or theologically accurate, his defense was that they worked. This is 19th century American pragmatism. It works, so do it, right? He was an active revivalist, but also an active social reformer. He believed in benevolence, caring for those who were under-resourced and underprivileged. He affirmed abolitionism, thought that evangelicalism and God's complete respect for all, God is not a respecter of persons, that grace is bestowed equally upon everyone, and everyone has the freedom to choose on their own, had no room for institutional slavery. He also believed in educational reform. He founded Oberlin College and actually had full admission for women students. We'll talk a little bit about women before we're done tonight, but remember, this was at a time in American life where women couldn't even own property and women could not vote, right? Significant strains of significant revival and reform in American life. He was also an advocate for Sabbatarianism and temperance and peace, a promoter of phrenology and the Graham diet and nutrition. He was on the cutting edge of all kinds of social and cultural reforms. He had a stronger influence than anyone in New England ever did on the individual responsibility and power of the human will to be entirely sanctified and to choose that which was good. He went through a dramatic conversion in 1821 while he was a legal apprentice, a young lawyer in New York. He immediately dropped his profession, began preaching, and was catapulted to notoriety with the Great Revival in Rochester, New York, in 1830 and 1831. That region of upstate New York along the newly created Erie Canal became what Americans called the burned over district, because revival fires burned through there so many times that you really couldn't understand anything about that region without understanding it as the powers of revival. He broke from traditional Presbyterianism, founded Oberlin College in Ohio. Notice, right, that he didn't found a college in Boston or in New York or in New Jersey or even Connecticut, but in Ohio, right, away from the established moral and cultural authorities of the East Coast in American life. Probably most important in terms of his new measures for his revivals, like we mentioned very briefly last week, is the coming of the anxious bench. The anxious bench was a central tool in his revival meetings to encourage immediate and public commitment of faith. The anxious bench was a designated front row seat or a section in the front left empty where individuals who were under deep conviction of the Holy Spirit and of conviction of sin were invited for conversion to sit, reflect, and act. Finney believed that physical movement and public declaration played a role in spiritual transformation. So by coming forward to the anxious bench, individuals signaled their openness to repentance and conversion, placing them under direct physical and spiritual and social pressure to make a decision for Christ at that moment. This technique broke from traditional Calvinist views that emphasized waiting for divine grace. Instead, it reinforces Finney's understanding of a new measure, a set of revival methods that were designed to elicit an immediate emotional response, an immediate decision for salvation. The anxious bench then became a hallmark of Finney's revivalism, oftentimes out of doors, and also influenced later evangelistic practices, including the altar calls by 19th century revivalist Dwight Moody, and eventually the 20th century revivals of Billy Graham, borrowed directly from Charles Finney. When I was growing up, there was a song that we used to sing in youth group. The moment of truth is here for you. This moment may never come again. Right? The time is now. Act. At the same time, out of this particular period of pragmatic revivalistic messages, we realized that Charles Finney was actually more Arminian even than Wesley. Wesley believed that the human will was incapable of choosing God without what he called God's prevenient grace, that the grace of God that makes it even possible for you to think about approaching God. But Finney thought that human perfection was open to anyone who would pursue it. The gospel is becoming more and more democratized and focused on individual action and moral conversion. To conclude our conversation here, we'll talk quickly about the mobilization of the Baptists during this particular period as well. As we've talked about theologically, we go from the Calvinistic to a modern Arminian position. In terms of missions, the General Missionary Convention of the Baptist denomination in the U.S. was started in 1814. The Baptist Missionary Society was started in 1802, and the American Baptist Home Mission Society was begun in 1832. We'll talk about this certainly more in the upcoming couple of weeks as we get to the American Civil War. But in the 1840s, the Methodists actually split. It was in the context of these foreign mission and home mission bodies that when candidates were being interviewed as to whether or not they could participate as missionaries, either internationally or in the United States, national missions agencies began to raise serious objections to those who owned slaves, denying candidates because of the moral, what they saw as moral compromise of slave owning. In this particular context, the Methodists in the mid-1840s split in half, and in 1845 we see the formation of the Southern Baptist Church. That Southern Baptist Church is not only one that affirms the Christian theological and moral superiority of the institution of slavery, but it's also the one that carries the more conservative biblicism and biblical interpretive conservatism of American evangelicalism. This is a legacy that has far-reaching implications in American life, all the way into the present. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the upcoming couple of weeks. Eventually, and I'm not going to give you, I didn't even put it on a screen because it's just too much detail, but I thought it would be, there's some terms that you may be coming across every once in a while in life, and I thought I could provide you some of them. You hear about free grace, free will, free salvation Baptists, right? The Baptists call themselves all sorts of things, but the free grace, free will Baptists and the free salvation Baptists were generally becoming more Arminian, with a larger role played by the individual in the process of becoming a Christian. And then there were the primitive, or old school, or hard shell. They even called themselves anti-mission Baptists, who remained more Calvinistic and focused primarily on local church governance rather than bigger cooperative societies. So the Baptist tradition begins to grow and splinter in the middle decades of the 19th century. Before we're done today, I want to talk about a couple more things. The first is a new visibility for women. One thing that's important to recognize about the democratic impulse of American evangelicalism that comes out of the Second Great Awakening is that women were just as able to be as entirely sanctified as men. Again, remember, this is a time when women could not own property and vote, certainly in national elections and almost any state election at this particular point. What you see here is actually a picture from the Seneca Falls Convention. I'll talk about that in just a minute, in 1848. The two leading figures for that movement, you see Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Quaker Lucretia Mott, who were actively engaged. But I put up a screen here of several notable women that we should be aware of that were really beginning to change the face of the American Christian experience. Mother Ann Lee was a Quaker who eventually came and founded a utopian society in New England. When I was in seminary at Gordon Conwell, actually one of their main centers was in Concord, New Hampshire. You can still go visit the Shaker area there today. This was a utopian society that did not believe in marriage or sexual activity of any kind. How did you grow, then, you might ask? They did so by adopting orphans, right? So they were justice-minded and reform-minded. She was and they had very distinct religious practices, and they marched as groups of men and groups of women in worship. A very interesting story if you want to learn more about Mother Ann Lee and the New England Shakers. They actually had presence all over, even moved west in the United States as well. There's also the story of Phoebe Palmer, right? She was raised in New York in a Christian home. Through her own very powerful conversion experience, she taught Bible and had a Bible class that she taught primarily to women. And then in 1837, she had a deeper experience of faith, what we might call roughly akin to the Methodist second blessing. She called it in her own diary, the Day of Days. She began to share her experience in an open forum, which soon began to attract not only women, but also men. It actually began to attract hundreds of people on a weekly basis. People from all over the colonies and from Europe came to actually hear Phoebe Palmer speak. It became known as the, quote, Tuesday meeting for the promotion of holiness, unquote. And it became very popular, and she eventually wrote a book called The Way of Holiness that sold hundreds of thousands of copies, and she became a leader in the holiness movement across the United States. Antoinette Brown, who you see pictured there, was ordained as a minister in the Congregational Church. In the early 19th century, was the very first female to be formally ordained in America. Interesting that the first women weren't ordained in covenant life until 1976. The Congregationalists were doing it in the Congregational Church in New England and in New York in the early 19th century. So structures of authority began to shift and change as a result of the powerful influence of the Second Great Awakening. And then, of course, I have a series of pictures of women here that in various aspects of reform in the 19th century, these are from the mid to the early to the mid and even the late 19th and into the early 20th century with Jane Addams. But Angela and Sarah Grimke were activists against slavery as Quakers and early abolitionists whose writings and social activity attracted an entire nation. Dorothea Dix argued for the better treatment of the mentally ill, of the insane, as they called them in the 19th century. Catherine Beecher, who was daughter to Lyman Beecher, argued for education as well as higher education and opportunities for women. Frances Willard, later in the 19th century, became a crusader for temperance in the American Christian Temperance Union, the evils of alcohol. And then finally, the person largely responsible for the birth of the entire intellectual and social movement of social work. Work among early immigrants in large American cities was Jane Addams. The Jane Addams School of Social Work is actually at UIC here in the city of Chicago. One interesting fact, in 1810, Chicago's population in 1810 was the compact nature of teeming population, roughly akin to today's Calcutta, right? In 1810 Chicago, virtually nobody spoke English, right? The city we live in has always been a steaming cauldron of global diversity. And Jane Addams was one of the ones who was caring for those immigrants, many of whom were suffering. So the 19th century really is in many ways a women's century, as the power and influence of the Second Great Awakening empowers religious reform, and in the new open space of cultural engagement, women begin to play a much more active role in American life. Before I go any further, I want to talk just a little bit about Seneca Falls. This is an opportunity for you at some point to go. Actually, Kathy and I, one time driving home from Massachusetts, we took a day and stopped in Seneca Falls, New York, with my son Emmett, and there's a museum there to women's rights and suffrage. In 1848, it was the first formal call for women's rights and the right to vote. Not only were people like Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others present, but as was Sojourner Truth, whose very famous Ain't I a Woman speech took place in New York, as well as Frederick Douglass also spoke to that group in 1848. It was the first formal women's rights call to the right to vote. The meeting took place in a Wesleyan Methodist church, though Mott was a Quaker. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first formal women's rights convention in the United States. The convention, as I mentioned, was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, and now I'm just repeating myself over and over again. But the attendees discussed women's rights in society, religion, and politics. Elizabeth Cady Stanton read a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence, where women had not been given the freedoms that men were at the time of the American Revolution in the 1770s. Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave and abolitionist, spoke in support of women's rights, and 68 women and 32 men signed that Declaration of Sentiments in 1848. The convention launched the women's suffrage movement that would not have ultimate effect until the 20th century with the universal women's suffrage and to the U.S. Constitution. And the convention demonstrated women's struggles for civil rights, human rights, and equality as early as the 1830s. Now, before we're done tonight, the last thing we'll talk about is the rise of global missions. The Second Great Awakening and its desire for the conversion of souls led to the rise of global missions, which was a contemporary movement, by the way, in England as well. The zeal of the Great Awakening found voice in developing American foreign mission societies. They were primarily motivated by a combination of religious, cultural, and nationalistic tendencies. Samuel Mills, who lived from 1783 to 1818, was part of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions that was created in 1810, and they sent missionaries to India and the Far East. Adoniram Judson was a Baptist missionary, spent almost 40 years in Burma, and while there was actively engaged in the practical ministry of international missions, not only preaching the gospel, but translating the Bible, establishing churches, opening schools, educating young people, boys and girls, training preachers, and opening orphanages. At the same time that there was a zeal to convert souls, one of the lasting legacies of the rise of global missions in the United States and England, the Anglo-American rise of global missions, is also the moral and civilizing vision of common sense realism that found expression in American evangelicalism, but also, unfortunately, the moral vision of democracy in American exceptionalism. So while they were on a Christian mission, they were also oftentimes seen as being on an American mission to expand an American notion of faith, conversion, and what it meant to live truly as a Christian. So democracy and education and Protestant ethics were also part of that conversion-oriented message of global missions, which, by the way, is a lasting legacy that we have to deal with as Christians and evangelical Christians who bring the gospel into other parts of the world. Subsequent generations and into the 20th and 21st century has spent an awful lot of time trying to parse out the work of early missionaries, how much of their work was the work of the gospel, and how much of their work was the work of the culture they were engaging, which of course it was both. And it's part of that ongoing legacy that we have to contend with in our life as Christian people. Well, that's it for the Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, right? A fundamental change in American life and a new way of thinking, new measures, outside the church revival meetings, the anxious bench to encourage people to make a decision right now, a view of the second blessing and entire sanctification that put more effort and import and influence on individual decision-making rather than the prevenient or the early work of grace that God provided in a Calvinistic concept. Completely consistent with democracy and the needs of a theology that were demanded because of an expanding frontier context for sharing the Christian message. Things change fast, and they changed for good, and they completely changed the way that American evangelicals and Christians begin to understand their world and understand and communicate their Christian faith. We'll talk about some of those details in class. Thanks, everybody.